The gavel was about to fall. Walter Carter stood at the defendant's table, wrists shackled, eyes hollow from decades of labor and betrayal. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled with whispers that cut deeper than the chains around his wrists. Thief. Liar. A man unworthy of mercy. He had heard it all before. On factory floors, in corner stores, in the mouths of neighbors who never forgave him for one thing. Daring to raise two children who weren't his own. Daring to love where others saw scandal. The prosecutor leaned forward, lips curled in a smile that promised finality. His boss, Mr. Harlan, sat smug in the gallery, arms crossed, satisfied that the trap had finally snapped shut. The judge cleared his throat, voice heavy with authority. "Walter Green Carter, you stand convicted." Walter's chest tightened, the weight of years pressed down. This was it, his life reduced to ashes. But then, the doors creaked open. Two figures entered, moving with quiet confidence. Heads turned. Whispers shifted into gasps. They were no longer the children Walter once carried in from a frozen alley, half-starved and shivering. They were grown now, strong, unshaken, fire in their eyes. They had come for him, and what they were about to reveal would shake the entire room. Pause. Narrator steps back in time to show how they all got here. The winter that year bit through thin coats and worn shoes like a knife. In Oak Haven, a small industrial town where smokestacks painted the sky gray, people hurried with heads down, eager to escape the chill. For those left behind, the streets offered nothing but cold steel, smoke, and silence. Walter Carter, a black man in his late 50s, walked slowly home after another punishing shift at the steel factory. His limp, a relic of years spent hauling iron and bending under the weight of machines, dragged with every step. His boss, Harlan, said he was too slow, too useless, a man lucky to still have a job. Walter never argued. He had learned long, ego, that pride didn't put food on the table. As he passed the alley behind the diner, the hum of freezer fans mixed with the whistling wind. There, huddled against a dumpster, were two children. A boy, maybe 10, with his arm wrapped around. A younger girl. Their faces pale, their clothes little more than rags. They didn't cry. They just stared, eyes too old for their years. Walter froze. He could have walked on. Most people did. His boss's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't waste time on strays. You can barely feed yourself." And he was right. Walter's meals were scraps, his apartment barely warm. But something stronger than hunger tugged at him. He crouched, his knees creaking. "You two got anywhere to go?" he asked softly. Silence, just a slow shake of the head. Walter exhaled, breath fogging in the air. He knew what it meant to be discarded, to be invisible. He reached out his calloused hand. "Not tonight," he whispered. "Come on." The boy hesitated, but the girl's tiny fingers slipped into his palm. Ice cold, fragile. That was enough. When he led them into his building, neighbors peeked through cracked doors. "That fool," one muttered. "Old man can't pay his own bills. Now he's dragging strays inside." Another chuckled. "He'll sink with them." Walter heard. He always heard. But he just kept walking. Two fragile lives following behind him. Inside his apartment was no palace. Peeling wallpaper, a sagging couch, a rattling heater that groaned louder than it warmed. But it was shelter. Walter laid out blankets, warmed broth on the stove, and watched as the children ate like they hadn't touched food in days. That night, as he sat in the corner rubbing his aching leg, Walter thought about what tomorrow would bring. Harlan's insults, thin paychecks, the neighbors' whispers. But he also knew this. Those kids wouldn't be sleeping on frozen concrete anymore, not while he was alive. And with that quiet decision, a bond was sealed. one that would echo, far louder than he could imagine. The days ahead were not easy. Walter's limp slowed him at the factory, and every insult from Harlan cut deeper. But at night, the weight lifted when the children, Eli, the boy with sharp eyes and a book, always in hand, and Grace, the girl with a dull pencil and a fierce little spirit, ran to him at the door. He gave them his meals when cupboards thinned, patched their clothes with clumsy stitches, huddled with them under blankets when the heater failed. Neighbors whispered louder now. A black man raising 2 white kids? Shameful. Walter heard. He never answered. He poured everything into those children, and for the first time in years, Walter felt something bloom in the cold. Hope. Oak Haven was not a place that welcomed difference. People lived in tight boxes, same shifts, same pay, same faces at church on Sunday. And Walter Carter? He broke every unspoken rule just by being himself. A black man, living alone, and now raising 2 white children who had no one else. In the town's eyes, it was unnatural, dangerous even. At first, it was whispers. Mothers clutching their children's hands tighter when Walter passed by with Eli and Grace. A cashier at the grocery store lingering a little too long before handing him change. A neighbor muttering, "What kind of man does that?" under his breath. But over time, whispers grew sharper. One night, as Walter carried home a bag of bruised apples he'd bought on discount, 2 men leaning against a lamppost chuckled. "Playing daddy now, Green?" one sneered. "They ain't yours. Everyone knows they'll turn on you when they're grown." The other spat on the sidewalk. "Doesn't matter what he does, he's still just a black fool pretending." Walter didn't answer. He never did. He just shifted the bag in his arms and walked on. But the words clung to him like smoke. At the factory, things were no better. Harlan had always been cruel, but now he had new material. He'd bark across the shop floor loud enough for everyone to hear. "Green, you're slower than those orphans you dragged home." Laughter would ripple through the workers. Some laughed because they wanted to please Harlan. Others because joining in was easier than standing apart. Walter swallowed it all, every insult, every snicker. He had no choice. His wages, meager as they were, kept food in his children's mouths. At night, though, the insults seemed to fade. He'd open his apartment door to find Eli with a book clutched in his hands, eager to read aloud what he'd learned at school. Grace sat at the wobbly kitchen table, drawing houses brighter and warmer than the one they lived in. Walter would listen, smile, and let pride swell in his chest. They didn't see the man mocked by his boss. They saw a father, and that was enough. When Grace fell sick one winter, coughing until her tiny frame shook, Walter faced a choice. Harlan had denied him time off before, sneering, "You're not their father. Stop playing hero and get back to work." This time, Walter didn't ask. He simply didn't show. He held Grace's hand and walked her to the clinic, coins jingling faintly in his pocket. By the end of the day, the doctor had given medicine. By the end of the week, Harlan had cut Walter's pay in half. Walter never told the children. He hid the slip in his coat pocket, smiled when Eli asked if everything was all right, and ladled broth into their bowls. That night, his stomach growled. Louder than theirs, but he didn't mind. Grace's breathing was steady again. That was all that mattered. Passed this way. Sacrifice, layered on sacrifice. Walter's limp grew heavier, his back more bent, but the children stood taller. Eli's sharp mind won him scholarships Harlan swore he'd never earn. Grace, once a quiet girl with pencils, grew into a fierce voice in school debates. Neighbors still whispered, "He'll end up in the gutter with them." But when Eli walked across the stage at graduation and Grace delivered a speech that made the auditorium roar, Walter sat in the back, tears brimming, knowing he'd given them something no insult could erase. Still, Harlan never let him forget his place. When Walter dared ask for gloves to ease his aching hands, Harlan sneered. "Be grateful you've got work. Men like you ought to remember what side of the fence they're on." But beneath the cruelty, something else festered. Envy. Harlan saw the pride in Walter's eyes when he spoke of the children. He heard whispers about Eli studying law, Grace chasing journalism. He watched Walter walk a little taller despite the limp, and it burned him. Because for all his power, all his spite, Harlan couldn't break Walter's spirit. He couldn't stand that a man he called useless had built a family out of nothing, dignity out of scraps. And in that bitterness, the seeds of betrayal began to grow. The years of sacrifice had not gone unnoticed. Neighbors who once mocked began to grudgingly admit the children had grown into fine young people. Teachers praised Eli's sharp mind. Grace's essays appeared in the local paper. And through it, all Walter, bent and weary, kept showing up at the factory, day after punishing day. But Harlan noticed too, and where others saw inspiration, he saw insult. How could a man he'd spent years calling worthless now carry himself with pride? How could the orphans Walter had raised be headed for futures brighter than his own children? Resentment festered into something darker. One autumn morning, Walter returned from a long shift to find two policemen waiting outside his door, their uniforms crisp, their eyes hard. His neighbors leaned from windows, muttering, "Told you he'd end up in trouble." Walter's heart thudded as the officers pushed past him into the apartment. They tore cushions from his couch, yanked drawers from cabinets, kicked open the closet door. From under the couch cushion, one officer pulled a bag. Inside, cash, factory tools, property stamped with the company logo. Walter's knees buckled. He had never seen it before. Within hours, the metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. The neighbors whispered louder now. Knew he was too good to be true. A black man raising white kids always knew it'd end like this. At the factory gates, Harlan stood with arms crossed, smirk stretched wide. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all," he jeered, loud enough for the workers to hear. Some laughed. Others turned away, shame flickering in their eyes. Walter said nothing. He just stared at the ground as they led him away. The courtroom smelled of varnish and dust. Walter sat hunched at the defendant's table, wrists chained, his once strong shoulders sagging under invisible weight. The prosecution painted him as a bitter old man who had stolen to survive. They called him desperate, untrustworthy, a liar who'd hidden behind charity to mask his true nature. The evidence? Thin at best. A bag found in his home. Testimony from workers Harlan had quietly paid off, swearing they'd seen Walter sneaking into storage rooms. And the yes-a whispers in the benches, louder than the facts. I knew he was no saint. He fooled us all. A thief hiding behind pity. The defense lawyer assigned to Walter was young, overworked, and underprepared. He stammered, filed motions too late, missed objections that could have mattered. Walter wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, but years of swallowing insults had trained him into silence. Then came the eyewitness. A middle-aged woman pointed shakily at Walter from the stand. She claimed she'd seen him near the factory on the night equipment had gone missing. What the jury didn't know, what Walter would only learn decades later, was that she had hesitated in the lineup, pressured by detectives, until she chose the one photo that stood out. Walter's, the only one well lit. Walter's alibi was Eli and Grace. That night he had been at home, listening to Eli read a passage from a school book while Grace drew pictures at the kitchen table. But the prosecutor pounced. Children loyal to the man who feeds them, he sneered. There, words cannot be trusted, the judge agreed. Their testimony was dismissed. The trial was less about facts than about fear, less about justice than about prejudice. Walter was not judged for evidence. He was judged for daring to exist outside the box Oakhaven had built for him. A black man raising white children, a poor man walking with dignity, a worker who dared to think he deserved more, and the jury, all white, all peers of Harlan's friends and neighbors, didn't need much convincing. After only 3 hours of deliberation, they filed back in. Their faces were grim, certain. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. Guilty. The words slammed into Walter like a hammer. He gripped the table to steady himself, breath shallow. His eyes searched the room, not for mercy, but for the children he had raised. He prayed they had stayed away, that they would never see him like this. The judge's voice boomed. Walter Carter, for the crime of theft and embezzlement aggravated by breach of trust, you are sentenced to life in prison. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some whispered that justice had been served. Others, the ones who remembered how Walter had fed those children, how he had limped home every night from the factory, looked down in shame. Walter's chains rattled as guards pulled him to his feet. He stumbled once, his limp dragging, heavy. He thought of Eli and Grace, their laughter, their drawings pinned to his wall. He thought of the nights he had gone without food so they wouldn't, and as the gavel struck, echoing like a death knell, Walter's heart whispered the one. Truth he could not speak aloud. Maybe they were right. Maybe a man like him was never meant to rise above his place. In the back of the courtroom, behind the heavy wooden doors, 2 children cried silently into each other's arms as social workers led them away. And so the family Walter had built with kindness was shattered in a single stroke. Not by truth, not by justice, but by prejudice sharpened into law. 20 years. It's long enough for a child to become a parent, for a generation to turn over, for hope itself to wither. For Walter Carter, those years blurred into a gray haze of concrete walls and steel doors. Prison life stripped him of everything but breath. The clang of gates, the scrape of boots on tile, the endless shuffle of men who, like him, had been swallowed by a system that thrived on forgetting. He woke every morning to the same cracked ceiling, the same metallic taste of despair. His limp grew worse until every step felt like walking on broken glass. His hands, once strong from turning wrenches, grew soft and stiff. His hair, once black, turned the color of ash. But one thing he never surrendered was memory. He thought of Eli's eager voice reading aloud, of Grace's small fingers clutching a pencil. He clung to the image of their laughter in that sagging apartment, the way they had once called him Dad. In the quiet hours, when loneliness pressed hardest, those memories kept him breathing. He wrote letters, hundreds of them. Letters telling the children to stay strong, to chase their dreams, to never let bitterness take root. Letters describing the warmth of their bond, the nights huddled together against the cold, the pride he carried for them. Every letter came back, stamped, whereabouts unknown. It was as if the world had conspired to erase them from his life. But Walter kept writing, each word a prayer flung into the void. Eli and Grace, meanwhile, were trapped in a different kind of prison. The foster system swallowed them, moving them from house to house like mismatched furniture. Some homes were harsh, others indifferent, few ever kind. They clung to each other like shipwreck survivors. At night, when walls felt cold and unfamiliar, they whispered Walter's lessons to each other. Stand tall, even when the world tries to shrink you. Balance your coins. Every cent matters. Always do the right thing, especially when no one's watching. These became their commandments. The gospel of a man the world called a criminal, but they knew as a father. Eli, sharp-eyed and restless, devoured books. He read law texts long before he understood them, determined to learn the language of the system that had stolen Walter. Grace, with her fierce spirit, turned her pain into words, writing essays that challenged teachers, articles that pricked at the conscience of anyone willing to read them. By the time they aged out of foster care, they were scarred but unbroken. Eli took whatever jobs he could, janitor, night clerk, delivery driver, while studying law at night. Grace scribbled stories for local papers, fighting for space in a world that didn't want her voice. They had little money, fewer connections, but they had a mission. Free Walter Carter. Years passed. Eli graduated law school, diploma hard-won and stained with sacrifice. Grace clawed her way into journalism, her words sharp enough to pierce apathy. Every cent they earned beyond survival went into a fund, a quiet war chest for the day they could take on the system that stole their father. And Walter? He never knew. In his cell, he aged into someone the world would call an old man, shoulders bent, eyes dim. But inside, the ember of memory never went out. When guards mocked him, when appeals were denied, when nights stretched endless, he whispered to himself, "They know the truth. My children know the truth." And he was right. 20 years after the gavel fell, the children he once saved were no longer children. They were warriors, a lawyer and a journalist, two halves of one mission, and the storm they were about to unleash would shake the very foundations of Oak Haven's courthouse. The courthouse of Oak Haven looked the same as it had 20 years ago. Same polished wood, same smell of varnish and dust, same cold faces in the gallery benches. Only one thing was different. This time, Walter Carter wasn't alone. He sat shackled. At the defense table, back hunched, hair gray, eyes dulled by decades behind bars. To the crowd, he looked like a relic, a man broken, a man finished. Whispers fluttered again. Still claiming he's innocent? He wasted the court's time before. Better to lock him away for good. But then the doors at the back opened. Two figures entered, steady, purposeful. Heads turned, gasps rippled through the room. Eli, sharp-eyed in a dark suit, carried a stack of thick files. Grace, recorder in hand, her gaze fierce, followed just behind. They weren't children anymore. They were fire-given flesh. Walter's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't wanted them to see him like this. But as Eli set the files on the defense table and introduced himself as Walter's counsel, Walter's eyes filled with tears. His son, the boy who once read from school books at the kitchen table, was here as his lawyer. His daughter, the girl who once drew houses on scraps of paper, stood ready to wield her words like a blade. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You are Eli Carter," the young man said firmly. "Licensed attorney, and this is my client, my father." The gallery erupted in whispers. Harlan, seated smugly in the front row, shifted uncomfortably, for the first time. The prosecution began, certain of an easy win. They paraded their old witnesses, the same workers who had testified 20 years earlier. One swore again that he'd seen Walter near the storage rooms. But Eli's questions cut like knives. "Were you paid by anyone in the factory management to testify?" the man stammered. I can't recall." Eli pressed harder. "You signed this payment slip 2 days before your testimony." "Care to explain why?" the courtroom murmured. Another witness contradicted himself when Eli brought up records of his work schedule, proving he hadn't even been on shift the night of the supposed theft. Piece by piece, the prosecution's case crumbled. Then, Grace stood. She requested permission to submit a report. The judge, intrigued, allowed it. She handed copies to the clerk, who passed them around. It was a scathing exposé, Harlan's history of wage theft, harassment, falsified accounts. Documents Grace had unearthed through relentless investigation. "This is not the first time Mr. Harlan has lied to protect himself," she declared, voice steady but sharp. "It is simply the first time he's been caught." The crowd erupted. Some gasped. Others whispered furiously. Reporters scribbled notes with frantic energy. Harlan's face flushed crimson. "Lies!" he barked. "Baseless lies!" But no. One listened. His mask was cracking. Finally, Eli revealed the bombshell. From the evidence archives, he had uncovered a memo buried for 2 decades. Police had matched fingerprints on stolen equipment to another man, a known criminal who had been in town during the robbery. This memo had never been given to the defense, a textbook Brady violation. The judge's eyes narrowed. "You are telling me the prosecution withheld exculpatory evidence in a capital case?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eli replied, "and because of that, an innocent man lost 20 years of his life." The room fell into stunned silence. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen slowly. The weight of the moment pressed into every corner of the courtroom. "This case," he said finally, his voice echoing, "was built not on justice, but on manipulation, on prejudice, on lies. Therefore, the conviction of Walter Carter is vacated. He is to be released immediately." Gasps. Applause. A few jeers hurled at Harlan as he stormed out, face twisted in rage and humiliation. Walter sat frozen. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The words felt unreal, like sunlight in a dream. Then Eli placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and strong. Grace leaned close and whispered, voice breaking, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." That single word, Dad, echoed louder than the gavel that struck to end the case. Outside the prison gates, the sky was a brilliant blue. Walter walked out, chains gone, back straighter than it had been in years. And waiting there, arms wide, were Eli and Grace. They ran to him, and when they collided, the hug wasn't just an embrace. It was 20 years of silence shattered, of birthdays missed, of letters returned unopened. It was pain melting into pride, despair into love. Neighbors who once sneered now watched in silence. Reporters scribbled furiously. And Walter Carter, old, weary but unbroken, finally lifted his eyes to the world without shame. He had once lifted 2 children out of the cold. 20 years later, they had lifted him out of a cage. Because kindness doesn't die. It waits, it grows, and when the time is right, it saves. Walter now spends his days quietly, walking through a world transformed by decades he never saw. He marvels at smartphones, at the internet, at how quickly everything changed. But what matters most hasn't changed at all. Eli and Grace at his side, sharing meals, laughing at small things, making up for lost time. Their story is fictional, but the injustice behind it is tragically real. Across America, Black men are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder than white men. Eyewitness misidentifications, withheld evidence, and systemic bias have stolen thousands of years of freedom from innocent lives. The Innocence Project and similar organizations fight every day to right these wrongs, but true justice requires more than legal battles. It requires us, as a society, to confront the prejudice that put men like Walter behind bars in the first place. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Let it remind you that every act of compassion plants a seed, and sometimes those seeds grow into the very force that saves us. For more stories of injustice, redemption, and the power of human spirit, make sure to subscribe and click on the next video, because these aren't just stories. They're truths the world needs to see.